Three student researchers recently completed a study using a multiple baseline design. Their supervisor identified several confounds during the intervention and indicated that the research should be replicated before it is submitted for publication. The study may lack what? All right, so on the exam, you're going to have to know a lot about experimental designs, research designs, and what it takes to complete a research project, right? In this case, what are we looking at? Well, the supervisor said there are several confounds during the intervention, and the supervisor believes the research should be replicated. Why is that? Well, if we have confounds, what are we concerned about? We're probably concerned that our experiment and our manipulation isn't the variable controlling the outcome. In other words, what we're doing in the experiment isn't what's impacting the outcome of the experiment, but something else, such as these confounds. So if we're worried about our experiment and the outcome not being a result of our treatment, what are we worried about? Are we worried about internal validity, external validity, participant retention, or sufficient baseline data? Well, we can eliminate participant retention. All right, that is the dropout of participants or participants dropping out or staying with your experiment. We're not necessarily worried about that here. Okay, we don't mention any participant data in the question. Neither do we mention baseline data. All right, if we've already started this intervention, we've completed the intervention, we can assume we had sufficient baseline data. So that leaves us with internal validity and external validity. And what is the difference? Internal validity, we're looking inside our own experiment. Are we actually controlling the outcome of the experiment through our manipulations, or is there something else at play, such as these confounds? Okay, so A looks like our answer, right? B, external validity. What are we worried about with external validity? Well, now we're looking at the outside environment. Outside of our experiment, is our experiment going to generalize away from our contained lab, so to speak? Okay, so that being said, if we're looking at confounds, we're worried about our internal intervention, our experiment not being a result of our outcome or our manipulations, but other confounds. What are we worried about? We are worried about A, internal validity. Before Susan, a BCBA, finalizes her treatment plan, she makes sure she conducts at least three direct observations with her client. This most closely adheres to what attitude of science? So remember, on the exam, you need to know the attitudes of science and the dimensions of behavior analysis. This is an attitudes of science question. Okay, these are mostly straightforward questions, right? If you know what each attitude is, and even what each dimension is, these questions aren't too complicated, okay? So if we want to make sure you conduct three direct observations, what attitude of science are you looking at? Are you looking at A, parsimony? Parsimony is the simplest explanation. Are we discussing any explanations here? Are we discussing simplest theories here? No, we're talking about observations, okay? So what about B, experimentation? We don't get experimentation and empiricism confused. Experimentation, okay, we're actually manipulating things, right? We're experimenting. Okay, going back to our previous question about internal validity, confounds. Experimentation, we are actually manipulating antecedents, consequences, and variables. Okay, we're not just observing. Empiricism, now we're observing and we're relying on observation, okay, to make some of our decisions, right? So if Susan is relying on three direct observations, she is relying on empiricism. Always read all of your answer choices, especially when you're practicing and studying. Understand why the wrong answers are wrong. What is D? Determinism. Determinism should probably be the easiest attitude of science because it's what we adhere to, right? We live by this. Behavior is determined. Behavior is lawful. Behavior happens for a reason. And although that is true, we don't talk about that necessarily here. We're focused on Susan's observations. So I think that's the key to the attitudes of science questions and the dimension questions, okay? You can make a lot of assumptions, right? We can assume Susan is going by parsimony and determinism, but what is the question really focused on? And that's the key. The question is focused on the observations. Therefore, we are focused on empiricism. Based on the table below, how would you describe the trend of the data? Okay, so on the exam, we're going to need to know trend, level, variability. At this point, this is some of the most basic stuff we can do with graphing. You should know this by now, in my opinion. Okay, you need to know trend, variability, and level like the back of your hand. Very straightforward stuff. They give you pen and paper on the exam if you need to chart this, but I think you can answer this question without charting. I think it's a very straightforward charting question, graphing question. So based on this table below our data, how would you describe the trend? Let's look at trial 1. We have 3, trial 2, 4, trial 3, 3, trial 4, 5, trial 5, 4. If you graph this, how would it look? Well, we start at 3, we go up 1, we go back down 1, we go up 2, and back down 1. Is there a clear increase? Not really. We go from 3, 4, 3, 5, back to 4. We're just kind of hovering around that same middle. Is there a clear decrease? Same thing. We're increasing, then we decrease, then we increase, then we decrease again. Based on this data and visual analysis, there looks like no trend. So on the exam, and visual analysis obviously is subjective, on the exam it's going to be pretty clear whether there's a trend, whether there's a level change, whether there's a variability change. I don't think these questions are too difficult. I don't think you have too much to worry about if they're giving you trend questions. And then variable, we're not describing our trend as variable. Our trend is going to be increasing, decreasing, or no trend. And in this case, we have no trend. An RBT teaches a child to match the word dog to a picture of a dog. Then she goes outside and matches the picture of a dog to an actual dog. She then tests to see if the child can match the word dog to an actual dog. This is considered teaching what? So if we break it down, if our word dog is A, the picture of a dog is B, we have A equals B, therefore B equals A. She goes outside and matches the picture of the dog B to an actual dog C, therefore B equals C, C equals B. If A equals B and B equals C, then we know A equals C. But we want to test to make sure the child knows that the word dog A equals C. If we're testing for that, what are we testing for? We're testing for transitivity. And if we're testing for transitivity, what are we teaching? Are we teaching functional communication? No, not necessarily. There is no functional communication going on here. We're simply ID matching. Are we teaching stimulus equivalence? Yes. Remember, reflexivity, symmetry, transitivity. We're teaching these matching skills, these A equals A's, these A equals B's, therefore B equals A, and then A equals B equals C, therefore C equals A. This is considered stimulus equivalence. What about C, PECS training? We're not teaching PECS here. We're not teaching any picture exchange communication. And then man training, where you're not teaching request. We are teaching stimulus equivalence. Stimulus equivalence gives people trouble. When you get a stimulus equivalence question on the exam, I would write it out, label it A, label it B, label it C. This question, you don't necessarily need to do that. They're not necessarily asking what level of stimulus equivalence. They're just asking you what you're teaching. If you know stimulus equivalence, if you know the 3 terms, reflexivity, symmetry, and transitivity, it's very clear. In this case, we're teaching stimulus equivalence. Non-contingent reinforcement is considered what type of intervention? So non-contingent reinforcement, we use it typically as an abolishing operation. A lot of times we use it in the condition of attention-based behavior, where we want to abolish a child's need for attention. So we will give them sporadic attention non-contingently. Remember what non-contingent means. There's no requirement. A contingency is an if-then statement. If you do this, then you do this. When we're delivering non-contingent reinforcement, there's no if. We're just delivering the reinforcement. NCR is considered what type of intervention? Is NCR, non-contingent reinforcement, an antecedent intervention? Yes. Non-contingent reinforcement is proactive. Typically, we're working non-contingent reinforcement to prevent behavior from happening. In the case of the attention-maintained behavior, we're trying to prevent the attention-maintained behavior from occurring. So we're doing this proactively. It's preventative. Therefore, it's an antecedent intervention. Antecedent interventions are proactive and preventative. Consequent interventions are reactive, right, and reflexive. Okay, we react to a behavior. Non-contingent reinforcement, we are doing something before the behavior occurs, therefore it's an antecedent intervention. Non-contingent reinforcement could technically be an establishing operation. It's typically used as an abolishing operation, but it's not considered an establishing operation, right, at all times. It's always an antecedent intervention. And then it's not a punishment intervention because it's not a consequence, right? So no matter what, NCR, non-contingent reinforcement, is going to be an antecedent intervention. It occurs before the response. You're delivering feedback to an RBT during supervision. You inform the RBT that they are running discrete trials correctly, but you would like to see them deliver reinforcement and feedback quicker following a response. What are you most likely concerned with regarding the reinforcement and feedback? Okay, I like this question. I think it's a pretty good question. I think it's an important term that we don't talk about often, but you definitely need to know. What is the question asking? The question wants to know, what are we concerned with regarding reinforcement? So you tell the RBT you're not delivering reinforcement and feedback quick enough following a response. In other words, the response occurs and too much time is passing before reinforcement and feedback is delivered. If we're worried about that time in between, what are we worried about? Are we worried about generality? We're not discussing generality here. We're not discussing a specific skill. We're just talking about the specific instances of reinforcement and feedback during DTT. So you can eliminate generality. What about B, contiguity? What is contiguity? Contiguity is the closeness of the consequence to the response, typically the closeness of the reinforcer to the response. What is our rule? We want reinforcement delivered as closely as possible and as quickly as possible to the response in every situation. Why is that? Because the longer we wait to deliver reinforcement after the response happens, the higher the chances we're going to reinforce something we don't intend to. If 10 seconds passes after the response and then we deliver reinforcement, that's 10 seconds where a whole lot of other responses could have occurred. We want that reinforcement quick and as fast and as close as possible to the responses as we can. That is contiguity. If you are telling them deliver reinforcement and feedback quicker following a response, we need that gap closer. You are concerned with contiguity. So B, we know is our answer. Let's read C and D. Always read all of your answer choices. You want the best answer, right? So magnitude, are we worried about magnitude? In other words, the size, right, of a reinforcement? Not really. We're not worried about the size or the intensity of the reinforcement. We're worried about the closeness. If we're worried about the closeness, we're worried about the contiguity. And then the length. Are we worried about how long reinforcement is delivered? No. Again, we're worried about the closeness, the time in between the response and the consequence. We're worried about the contiguity. B. Which of the following will be the least appropriate measure of headbanging during 3-minute intervals? This is a difficult question for a lot of people when they first start studying. I think it's a good representation of how you need to start thinking if you're new to studying for the BCBA exam. We're moving away from that RBT style of thinking where we're just following directions and we're not really always considering why we're doing something. Now you're going to be the BCABA or the BCBA. You're going to be the one in charge, and you need to consider your measurement systems, what's best in each scenario. In this case, which of the following is the least appropriate measure of headbanging during 3-minute intervals? A, rate. Could you use rate to measure headbanging in a 3-minute interval? Sure. Rate is just frequency over time. We could count how often headbanging happened and then divide it by 3. If headbanging happened 9 times in 3 minutes, it happens 3 times per minute. So rate is definitely a good call. What about partial interval recording? Yes, it sets up nicely for partial interval recording. If the behavior happens at all during the interval, we record it. Very straightforward. What about duration? What's wrong with duration? Well, think about the response of headbanging. It's very quick. It's very rapid. There's a clear beginning and end to headbanging. Would duration necessarily be a great choice here? Let's say the kid headbangs 30 times in a 3-minute interval. Imagine how difficult it's going to be to take duration on headbanging 30 times in 3 minutes. Headbanging lasts maybe a second because there's a clear beginning and end. Okay, how much good is duration going to do you? It's not going to be the best way to measure headbanging in this case. When you're looking at duration, we're measuring the length of one response. Headbanging is just so quick that it's not going to do a lot of good to give you how long is headbanging lasting, right? What about IRT? Could you measure the time in between headbanging? Sure. Headbanging happens once, 5 seconds passed. Headbanging happens again, 3 seconds passed. Headbanging happens again. That would be great. IRT would be fine because now we can work on increasing the IRT between headbanging. There's not much decreasing going on in terms of duration for headbanging. It's already a very, very quick response. So the least appropriate measure of headbanging would be duration. An 8-year-old in a general education classroom is struggling to read this year's assigned reading. Most of the assigned reading consists of chapter books. The teacher explains to the child's parents that the reason the child cannot read is because of his learning disability. This is considered what? Rule of thumb is we never, ever attribute behavior to a diagnosis. If you work with kids with autism, which a lot of you do, we never explain, hint, behavior through the lens of the diagnosis. If something occurs, a client, let's say, becomes aggressive, we never tell the parents, well, that's just a result of the autism. If a child decides to pull their sister's hair, elope from a table, we never explain it, well, that's just the result of the autism. Why? Because that's an explanatory fiction. We can't necessarily observe the autism, right? We can't do anything about it. As analysts, we're all about observing and measuring. What can we see? In this case, if the teacher is explaining to the child's parents, the child can't read because of his learning disability, that's just an explanatory fiction. They're explaining away the behavior through the disability. The cause and effect are the same. The child cannot read because of the learning disability. So the cause of the reading is a learning disability. Okay, and the effect is the same. Well, now they can't read. Okay, we're just going in a circle. We're explaining it away without any sort of observable or measurable term. So they are explaining away the child can't reading through a learning disability. That's an explanatory fiction. What's the hypothetical construct? These are events that explain behavior but aren't observable, like ego and frustration. These are all mentalisms. End of the day, hypothetical constructs, explanatory fictions, they're all just mentalisms. Okay, we don't necessarily deal in mentalisms as analysts because we can't observe them, we can't measure them. We can't just explain away behavior through a diagnosis because then what are we doing, right? What are we going to change? What about C, analytic? Are we being analytic? Absolutely not. We're not using any sort of data at all. And then a functional assessment. Just going through and saying the kid has a diagnosis is not a functional assessment at all. We are explaining away the child's ability to read through a fiction, so an explanatory fiction. Private events were first considered explainable behavior through what? Who first thought or considered private events behavior? Well, those are radical behaviorists. Methodological behaviorism did not consider these private events, okay? Now still, even though we are radical behaviorists, we don't necessarily deal in private events. And why is that? Because we can't see them. We can't observe them. We still want to do observable and measurable behaviors, but we do acknowledge that private events are behavior. Okay, and C, applied behavior analysis, and D, experimental analysis of behavior. Those came well after, all right? Private events, at least the applied behavior analysis did, but experimental analysis of behavior is a type of behaviorism, a type of what we do. Okay, but private events weren't first considered explainable behavior through it. It was through B, radical behaviorism. And we should definitely know this. We should definitely know what methodological behaviorism is and what radical behaviorism is as well. The data path on a cumulative record is best defined as what? Think about a cumulative record. What is the characteristic of a cumulative record? We're constantly graphing as data points happen. Do we ever decrease in a cumulative record? No, think of Skinner's cumulative record. It's always increasing. That little data path is always going up. Do we best define the data path as variable? Well, not necessarily, because we're always increasing. We're not going to have a sudden plummet in the data. It's always increasing. Is it B, always decreasing? No. Is it D, increasing and decreasing? No. A cumulative record, picture it in your head, the little ticker going up, is always increasing, cumulative. So we have our first data point. Next day, we have 3 data points. So we jump up and we're just accumulating data points on and on, ever increasing until we stop. All right, I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe if you did. Remember, we have our 5th edition task list